All right, SIG 2-3, it is 10 of February 2021. Playing catch up. This is from 3rd and 4th February, so just last week. However, here we go. Again, this is from Fort Observer. Political warning. Carroll, as in Kevin Carroll, hunt down fascist thugs like we did Al-Qaeda. Former Army and CIA officer Kevin Carroll, writing at the Washington Examiner, outlines 5 things the Biden administration must do to defeat domestic fascism. They include bringing felony charges against the Capitol rioters, make police and fire departments that receive federal funding swear an oath, quote, not to engage in acts to overthrow the government, end quote. Use the government to censor extremist talk on social media accounts and use alternative social media as honeypots to identify radicals, as the Joint Terrorism Task Force has done with Islamists. Ban militias and include civil liabilities to charges of domestic terrorism to deter future cases. Observer's note. Although Carroll is a former DHS official and former senior counsel to the House Homeland Security Committee, he has no known ties to the Biden administration, other than admittedly voting for Biden. Still, this thinking may be similar to what Biden advisors are preparing. Countering domestic violent extremism is a priority for the Biden administration, and several pieces of legislation have been introduced while executive action is likely being prepared. Socialist movement continues to build popular support. The Democratic Socialists of America announced a new milestone of 90,000 dues-paying members nationwide. Observer's note. The DSA is the largest socialist political organization in the country and has experienced a number of electoral successes for its endorsed candidates. In addition to the assortment of local politicians across the country, the DSA endorsed the following members of Congress: Jamal Bowman of New York, Cori Bush of Missouri, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Party growth likely indicates continued electoral success. In focus, former CIA officer calls for counterintelligence campaign against Trumpism. Writing at the New York Times last week, former CIA officer Robert Grenier characterized Trump supporters as a large swath of rural Americans fomenting an insurgency. He characterized this group of disaffected citizens as capable of producing endemic political violence. He calls for a number of steps to be taken in a counterinsurgency campaign against these insurgents. First, use law enforcement to investigate and bring these insurgents to trial, which is a common first step for these types of articles. Second, isolate and alienate the committed insurgents from the population. He doesn't go into detail, but offers an example of how U.S. and coalition forces work to limit the recruitment of the Sunni populace by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. The Observer spent 2008 and 2009 in Baghdad when AQI was a major source of indiscriminate violence and instability. Starting in 2005, Sunnis started to rise up against AQI, leading to the Anbar Awakening, the Sawa political movement, Sons of Iraq, and a host of Sunni militias who quite literally dragged AQI members out of mosques and shot them dead in the streets. It was largely Sunni tribal leaders reacting to AQI violence by influencing Sunnis to reject AQI ideology and report on AQI member identities and locations, which was a boon for targeting AQI leaders. Grenier is essentially calling for a whole-of-society approach to defeating Trumpist insurgents by isolating and alienating them from a broader conservative society. Again, Grenier doesn't explain how his American version of this would work. However, it's important to note exactly, rather than euphemistically, what happened during the Sunni campaign against AQI. It was a sort of a cultural revolution, albeit a violent one, that purged AQI from the Sunni populace. Third, Americans must listen to each other and engage in the battle of ideas. Grenier explains essentially that this is the only way to avoid alienating and radicalizing otherwise peaceful Americans who have quote-unquote daft political ideas. These ideas, he writes, must be met with reason and evidence and countered openly and truthfully instead of being censored. Grenier also makes the argument that government pursuit of the left's most radical ideas will serve as propaganda for the Trumpist insurgency and confirm the worst fears of the heartland. Finally, Grenier explains that, like a toppled Arab dictator, former President Donald Trump's veneer of invincibility must be similarly crushed. Grenier supports a Senate conviction which would bar Trump from seeking political office again and prevent his political leadership of the insurgency. Observers note, I'll agree that right-wing groups for the past decade have exhibited early-stage insurgent behavior, such as forging group identities based on political grievances, recruiting, acquiring firearms and training, and coordinating between groups, among other activities. Grenier correctly points out that this is driven by a politically and socially ascendant urban coalition of immigrants, minorities, and the college-educated secular elites of tech and mainstream media. He's absolutely correct when he points out that this coalition abridges their, or old America, religious freedoms, disparages and cancels most of their cherished beliefs, seeks to impose socialism, and is ultimately prepared to seize their guns. America is rapidly changing. As New America seeks to redefine a national identity by erasing Old America, it should be no surprise that this causes grievance, as it would and has in literally any other country. Historically, these transitions have led to low-intensity conflict and civil wars, which the left really should attempt to avoid. The left is less likely to inflame Old America, which honors tradition, through a more gradual approach to social change. As it stands, the country is changing too rapidly, which is leading to resentment and anger, and historically leads to violence. Probably the most salient point in this article is that the Biden administration pursuit of extreme left-wing policies will inflame the aforementioned sentiments. They've previously pointed out that these new domestic violent extremism, or DVE, efforts are probably not geared as much towards today as they are the future, where, for instance, gun rights and homeschool activists can easily be characterized as extremists. Grenier's counterinsurgency campaign prescription has been simplified for this Times article, but filling in the gaps shows that it can be an effective one if the Biden administration pursues it or something like it. The challenge for Old America is developing and implementing a political and social response to the new American cultural revolution, which is now being pushed by a whole of government effort. Historically, that solution has been violence, which is likely why there's such a media and political focus on DVE and counterinsurgency. Defense. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is calling for a nationwide military stand-down to discuss white nationalism and extremism within the ranks. Over the next 60 days, each military unit will cease training for operations for 1 day to discuss the dangers of extremism, which will presumably lead to accusations of extremist activity within the ranks. Observers note, according to a DoD press release, extremism is a small problem in the military. There have been several white nationalists identified as being on active duty, in addition to some allegedly active duty personnel present at the Capitol riot. According to the DoD, extremism includes gang membership, which is probably a far worse problem in the military than white nationalism. Low-intensity conflict in some. deportation could trigger new ICE protests. After a Texas judge issued a restraining order against the Biden administration's halt to deportations, ICE officers have continued to deport hundreds of illegal aliens. One of those deported is a witness to the 2019 El Paso, Texas shooting and had agreed to testify against the alleged shooter, white nationalist Patrick Crusius. Observers note, this deportation so far has not been widely reported, so it's unclear that it will receive much public attention. The news has been shared by several anti-fascist groups who have for years protested and disrupted ICE operations. Those actions include minor disruptions such as blocking employee vehicles from entering parking lots of ICE facilities to a 2019 firebomb attack in Tacoma, Washington. The knowledge of this deportation could trigger new protests against ICE officers and facilities. Armed leftists studying military tactical manuals. Members of the Socialist Rifle Association, or SRA, are studying the Special Forces Sniper Training and Employment Manual, published by the Department of the Army in 2013. The manual details a host of sniper-specific topics, including marksmanship training fundamentals, field skills, sniper employment considerations, ballistics knowledge, weapon systems, and urban operations tactics. Observers note, the study of military doctrine will provide some context to soldier tasks and responsibilities, but most will likely lack the frame of reference to put it all together. This is kind of like reading a book on how to build a house while still lacking the ability to build one. There are known leftist combat veterans, including from the special operations community, whose training and advice are likely more beneficial than these Army manuals. Still, the study of this and other manuals indicate a desire to develop an operational capacity to move beyond the square range. This desire is driven by the belief that fascist movements will pose a threat that must be countered with arms. The operational capacity of armed leftist groups remains very limited, although they have advanced their capabilities over the past couple of years. SRA members propose far-left digital community project. SRA members propose creating a digital leftist collective gun community project. This project would consist of various interviews, informational videos, tactical instruction series, and other related topics such as hunting and fieldcraft. The community would have contributors who post videos and content on a semi-regular basis. Observers note, armed leftist groups such as the SRA advertise themselves as the leftist alternative to traditionally conservative firearms culture in America. A campaign to create a far-left digital training platform would complement their efforts to build up their own networks of trainers, ranges, firearms retailers, and tactical gear manufacturing. Some members suggested that an exclusive network would bolster operational security, but other members are interested in setting up an open platform to serve as a passive recruitment tool. As with a physical firearms range and training facility, this will likely become an operations security problem, especially concerning the identity of its users. BLM activists march on New York police station. BLM activists marched on the Rochester Police Department in response to a video that was released showing officers pepper spraying a 9-year-old female. Upon arriving at the Rochester Police Department station, activists attempted to breach the station's perimeter. Organizers ordered the mob to disperse into smaller teams after failing to breach the internal fence. Observers note, Rochester was the site of significant riots in 2020 following the death of Daniel Prude after being taken into RPD custody. The assembly of a large crowd on short notice and ground-level command and control indicates an improving level of coordination. Roles appear to have been established ahead of time with an understanding of the responsibility of each and how much risk the crowd was willing to tolerate. Armed leftists warn members of increased federal law enforcement attention. Members of the Socialist Rifle Association continued claims that federal law enforcement has been visiting and harassing organizers. SRA accuses federal law enforcement of attempting to tie in SRA organizing to the type of violence that occurred at the Capitol protest. In response, SRA is creating Know Your Rights training materials for members, working with federal law attorneys and urging members not to speak with law enforcement. In addition, members are requesting the creation of a warrant canary to alert them if any warrants or subpoenas have been issued by the government. Observers note, many on the far left are concerned that expanded federal law enforcement efforts targeting domestic violent extremism will also apply to them. Earlier in the week, they reported on anti-fascist groups also experiencing an uptick in contact with federal agents in several states. Anarchist bloggers claim that government crackdowns on the right will precede far worse for the left. One anarchist predicted that any action against right-wing groups would be leveled tenfold against left-wing groups. Another warned that the domestic war on terror would also apply to anti-state left-wing groups. Federal efforts are aimed largely towards white nationalists, but leftist groups are bound to be targeted for investigations and arrests, as well as their role in disruptive demonstrations and violence against law enforcement. BLM and anti-fascists organizing disruptions in Pacific Northwest. Black Lives Matter activists and anti-fascist groups are planning multiple disruptions starting tonight. I believe this was put out on the 4th or 5th, and moving into the weekend in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. So this would have been this past weekend. In Seattle, the Black Liberation Movement is organizing a march to avenge, quote-unquote, Summer Taylor, a BLM activist in July 2020, by a driver who drove through an illegal traffic blockade on I-5. In the Portland area, anti-fascists are organizing a low-risk, quote-unquote, black bloc disruption of the suburb of Tigard, where they will be distributing propaganda flyers. Another autonomous anti-fascist disruption in Seattle is being planned for Valentine's Day, 14 February, to call for the abolition of immigrations and customs enforcement. Observers note, far-left groups are shaping their mission statements under the new administration. The latest pushes for public disruptions are focused on calls to revenge for those injured, arrested, or killed during the riots in 2020. In addition, they continue to push for the abolition of law enforcement, especially ICE, and bolster their influence in more suburban areas. Of note, approximately 100 Black Bloc anti-fascists vandalized city property and the local police station last month to avenge the death of Jacob McDuff. Upcoming event calendar. 13 February, I guess this weekend, F the Police March, the They Them Collective, Washington, D.C. 14 February, Abolish ICE March, Anti-Fascist, Seattle, Washington. 20 February, F the Police March, They Them Collective, Washington, D.C. 27 February, F the Police March, They Them Collective, Washington, D.C. That is it for that one. Let me prepare the next one. 623 out.